In the history of professional tennis, very few men have ever said less and meant more. Björn Borg spoke with his racket. 11 Grand Slam titles, 5 consecutive Wimbledons, 6 French Opens, a career win rate that most players couldn't reach in their best seasons. And when the racket was finally set down, when Borg walked away from the sport at 26, the best player in the world, mid-dynasty, he mostly went quiet for decades. So, when a man like Björn Borg, now in his 70th year, fighting prostate cancer with the same composure he once brought to a Wimbledon final, begins to open up about the players he has truly admired in this sport, you stop what you're doing, and you listen. Because through rare interviews, a candid memoir published in 2025, and decades of carefully chosen words, something remarkable has emerged from Borg's public record. A portrait of 5 players, drawn not from a formal list, but from what he has actually said, across 50 years of watching this game, that tells us exactly how Björn Borg defines greatness. And when you see those 5 names together, and understand why Borg has spoken about each of them the way he has, you will never look at tennis, or at Borg himself, the same way again. Before we look at the players, you need to understand the judge, because Borg's standard for what constitutes a truly great player is not what you'd expect from an 11-time Grand Slam champion. It isn't trophies, it isn't rankings, and it isn't records, although Borg has broken enough of them to know their value. Across his documented interviews and his 2025 memoir, Heartbeats, the first book he has ever written, Borg returns repeatedly to a small number of qualities: mental strength, the ability to endure, the willingness to stay in the fight when everything inside you wants to surrender, and, something rarer still, the ability to change what people believe is possible on a tennis court. Borg knows what it feels like to be that kind of player. He was the first man to prove you could dominate Wimbledon, historically a serve and volley cathedral, from the baseline. He changed the physical template of what a champion looked like. He changed the strategy. He changed the game. So, when he looks at others, that's the lens he uses. Not, how many did you win? But, what did you change? And did you have the mental architecture to sustain it? 5 players, drawn from Borg's documented record, pass that test. And the first name on this list is one that surprises almost everyone. Let's begin not at the bottom of the list, but at the beginning of the conversation. When Borg is asked, directly on the record, who the greatest tennis player of all time is, he does not hesitate. He names Novak Djokovic. In a 2024 interview with the Spanish outlet El Español, Borg was unambiguous. Djokovic, he said, is the best in history, purely by the numbers. The most Grand Slams, the most weeks at number 1, the most consistent performance across the most surfaces over the longest sustained period. But then Borg said something that complicates that verdict, something that reveals far more about how he actually thinks. He said that while Djokovic is the best, the 2 players who have meant the most to tennis as a sport, as a cultural force, as something larger than statistics, are Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer. That distinction between the best and the most meaningful is the key that unlocks everything else Borg has ever said about greatness. He is telling you that there is the answer you get when you count correctly, and there is a different answer when you ask what mattered. Those are not always the same thing. For Borg, Djokovic represents the summit, the undeniable peak. But Nadal and Federer represent something Borg values even more. They change the sport. And in doing so, they earned a place in Borg's thinking that no number of Grand Slams alone could buy. Of those 2, Nadal and Federer, Borg has made his deeper allegiance clear. In an interview with The Athletic, when asked to name the modern player who most reminds him of himself, Borg pointed directly to Rafael Nadal. Not because of the clay, not simply because both of them grew up building their game on slow red surfaces, but because of the way Nadal competes. He said, "I grew up on clay. Nadal grew up on clay. He's the one. To see him play on clay courts, it's so fantastic. He's unbelievable. I can relate to how he knows how to move players around the court." Now, for Borg to say "I can relate" is extraordinary. This is the Iceman, the player whose entire identity was built on emotional suppression, on compartmentalization, on the total separation of feeling from performance. He watched Nadal with the rituals, the screaming, the fist pumps, the visible war happening on his face at all times, and saw himself. What Borg was recognizing wasn't the emotion, it was the refusal, the same iron refusal, expressed through completely different wiring. Nadal's refusal to accept that a point was lost until the last mathematical possibility had expired. Borg's refusal, colder, quieter, but identical in its depth, to let anything external alter the internal state. The Iceman and the warrior. Different languages, same sentence. And then there is Roger Federer. After Federer's farewell at the 2022 Laver Cup, the final match of his career, played in doubles alongside Nadal, with both men in tears at the end, Borg was asked what he had witnessed. He told La Repubblica that Roger has decided to close happily like this, here at the Laver Cup, together with Nadal. I am honored to have been his coach these days. The other night was a great lesson for the young people. We will not see something like this for many, many years. A great lesson for the young people. From a man who gave the sport almost nothing in the way of public reflection across 4 decades, this was a rare and deliberate thing to say. But consider what it means, set against Borg's own story. Borg retired at 26. In his memoir, Heartbeats, he writes, "If I knew what was going to happen in the years after, I would continue to play tennis." He left. He was lost. He struggled. He found, eventually, some peace. But the sport went on without him, and some part of him has spent decades reckoning with that. Federer did what Borg couldn't bring himself to do. He stayed, for 20 years at the top, reinventing, enduring, coming back from injury after injury, competing at 40 against players who were children when he won his first Wimbledon. Borg called it a great lesson. What he may have meant, quietly, between the lines, in the only way Borg ever says the hardest things, is that Federer taught him something he had been too young, too exhausted, and too broken to understand at 26. That the court is the only place where certain things make sense. And leaving it too early is its own kind of loss. Now we arrive at the most complicated name on this list, John McEnroe, the man Borg has described as his greatest rival, his opposite in every visible way, and, as both men have spoken about in their 70s, one of his closest friends. In his memoir, Borg revisits the 1980 Wimbledon final at length. He calls it the most satisfying match I ever played. It had everything. McEnroe saved 7 championship points in a 4th-set tiebreak that lasted 18 minutes. The crowd barely breathed, and when Borg finally won the 5th set, he had survived something that no other match in his career had quite demanded of him. He said of his relationship with McEnroe, "We respected each other a lot. We were fighting to be the best in the world. To do that, you cannot be best friends." And now? We are very good friends. Me and John, we see each other. We go out for dinner. We talk about today's tennis. 14 head-to-head matches, 7 wins each. the most even rivalry in the history of the sport's most contested era. And here is what Borg has come to understand about McEnroe that the public record reveals slowly, across many interviews and many years. The volatility was not a flaw alongside the genius. It was the same thing. The nerve endings that made McEnroe explode at a linesman were the nerve endings that made him feel the ball in a way nobody else on tour could replicate. He played tennis the way certain musicians play, not by calculation, but by sensation. Every shot was instinctive. Every angle was felt before it was thought. Borg, built entirely on control, looked across the net at that chaos and couldn't dismiss it, couldn't beat it reliably, and couldn't explain it away. Because it was genius. Just a kind he had never seen before and will never see again. Which brings us to two names that require a different kind of storytelling. Because these are not names Borg has praised in viral interviews or bold public statements. These are names that emerge from the quieter parts of his record, from the texture of his career, from what he has chosen to be associated with, and what the people around him have said. The first is Stefan Edberg, Sweden's second great champion. 6 Grand Slam titles. The last great serve and volley player of his era. The man who won the 1983 Junior Grand Slam, all 4 majors in a single year, and then spent the next decade making that promise look like an understatement. Borg and Edberg represent a unique relationship in tennis history. They are compatriots from the same country, products of the same Swedish tennis culture, separated by exactly one era. Borg retired in 1983. Edberg reached his peak in 1990 and 1991, which means they barely overlapped at full strength. Borg watched Edberg from the outside, as a countryman, as a predecessor observing what came next. And what Edberg built was a game of almost startling completeness. The serve, the volley, the footwork that coaches still show to students as the model. The one-handed backhand widely considered the finest of his generation. Court intelligence so acute that he seemed to know where the ball was going before his opponent had decided. Edberg himself, in an interview, called Pete Sampras the most complete player he had ever seen, which gives you a sense of the standard he applied to others, and, by implication, to himself. For Borg, who changed baseline tennis forever, but who never possessed the Edberg serve, the Edberg net game, or the Edberg backhand, watching that kind of completeness from the outside must have carried its own particular feeling. Admiration. Maybe something close to wonder. A different kind of genius than his own. And finally, the name that may matter most. Not because of what Borg has said loudly, but because of what his silence around this name reveals about how he sees the sport's capacity for injustice. Guillermo Vilas, Argentine, born 1952. 4 Grand Slam titles. The 1977 French Open, the 1977 U.S. Open, the 1978 and 1979 Australian Open. 62 career titles. A heavy topspin forehand built for clay that could be transported with devastating effect to hard courts and carpet. In 1977, Vilas had one of the greatest single seasons in tennis history, a 131-13 record, 16 titles, the French Open, the U.S. Open, a 46-match winning streak that remains one of the longest in the Open era. And he was ranked number 2, not because anyone disputed what he had done, but because the ATP ranking system, 4 years old at the time and still working through its own logic, gave more weight to tournament tiers in a way that kept Jimmy Connors, who won 8 titles that year, including no Grand Slams, above him in the official computer. World Tennis Magazine declared Vilas the real number 1 for 1977. The International Tennis Hall of Fame acknowledged the claim informally. A 2020 Netflix documentary, Guillermo Vilas, settling the score, laid out the mathematical case in detail. But in May 2024, the ATP confirmed it would not officially recognize Vilas as the 1977 world number one. The case, they said, was closed. Borg and Vilas were friends. They practiced together. They ate together. They were, as one historian put it, bound by similar work ethics, similar love for the game, similar physical discipline. The Iceman and the Iron Man. Vilas once said of Borg, as they navigated the politics of the tour in the early 1980s, "The rules were not thinking about this guy, this great champion. Life rules itself. There is balance in life." What Borg has never done, publicly, on the record, is say those words back. But he chose to remain in close friendship with Vilas throughout his life. He was the peer who was there, who played against him in finals, who understood better than anyone what Vilas built in 1977. And in a sport that finally, formally, said no, that is not nothing. That is, in its own way, its own kind of verdict. So, what does this portrait of 5 players actually tell us? Not about the tennis, about the man. Djokovic, the one Borg names as the greatest by the numbers. The answer you give when you count everything correctly. Nadal, the one Borg sees himself in. The mental architecture he recognizes because he built it with different hands. Federer, the one who stayed, who did what Borg now admits, quietly, he wishes he had done. McEnroe, the rival, the opposite. The player who proved that Borg's way was not the only way to reach the summit. Edberg, the compatriot. The completeness Borg watched from the outside, with the particular tenderness of a predecessor watching what came after him. And Vilas, the friend. The player the system failed. The greatness that filled every honest record and was still turned away at the official door. Look at what those 5 names represent together. Statistical supremacy, emotional kinship, longevity, rivalrous respect, national legacy, uncredited genius. Borg is not giving you a ranking. He is giving you a map of every quality he has ever valued, every kind of greatness that has moved him across a lifetime of watching the sport that made him and nearly broke him. And if you look carefully at that map, you can see something else. You can see every part of himself he never put on public display. The ambition he suppressed behind the Iceman mask. The emotional depth he kept under lock and key on every court he ever walked onto. The regret for leaving too early. The awe at those who stayed. The fury at systems that count wrong. The loyalty to a friend the record books abandoned. Björn Borg published his first memoir in September 2025, at 69 years old, fighting prostate cancer with characteristic composure. He wrote, "Now I have a new opponent in cancer, one I can't control. But I'm going to beat it. I'm not giving up. I fight like every day is a Wimbledon final. And those usually go pretty well, don't they?" After all these years of silence, Borg is ready to share everything. Not in one dramatic interview, not in one formal list, but across a lifetime of carefully chosen words. In interviews, in memoirs, in friendships, in silences, Björn Borg has been telling us exactly what he believes about greatness. We just had to learn to read the Iceman. The court is silent now, and the verdict has been there all along.